On a cold October morning in 1909, a passenger train left a small Ontario station with the weight of ordinary life on board. Businessmen clutched their briefcases, mothers soothed restless children, and a handful of students awed at the prospect of freedom on the rails. The locomotive, polished and humming with power, rolled steadily into the mist. Witnesses would later swear the air felt heavier than usual, the forest unusually quiet, as though the landscape itself was holding its breath. The train's whistle echoed once, cutting through the silence like a blade, and then it was gone. Minutes turned to hours, hours to days, but the train never reached its destination. No wreckage was discovered. No survivors staggered from the woods. Not even a broken axle or a scorched scrap of iron was found along the track. It was as though the earth had swallowed the entire train wool. In the centuries since, this case has haunted both historians and storytellers. Official records confirmed that train's departure. Tickets were sold, and names were printed in passenger logs, yet the journey ended in nothingness. To the families waiting at the other end, the silence was unbearable. Loved ones vanished without risk, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables and letters unanswered forever. The company issued cautious statements suggesting delays, reroutes, or errors in documentation. But for the grieving, such explanations felt like ash. How could a machine of steel and iron, weighing thousands of tons, simply disappear into thin air? Locals began whispering about strange lights that had hovered in the tree line that morning, about a fog that crept low across the ground and clung to the tracks. Superstitions grew quickly, fueled by the absence of closure. Some spoke of spirits in the wilderness, ancient and jealous, who claimed what dared to trespass. Others murmured of time itself opening a door, pulling the train into a place beyond comprehension. Such tales sound fanciful, yet the fact remained: not a single piece of wreckage ever surfaced. And the longer the silence stretched, the more the mystery deepened, leaving fertile ground for folklore to bloom. Historians, ever cautious, have tried to approach the mystery with reason. They suggest that errors in logging, combined with poor record-keeping of the early 20th century, may have exaggerated or even fabricated the event. Some argue it was no Tony train, but several cases of confusion woven into a single legend. Yet even in dusty archives, the evidence resists dismissal. Ticket stubs exist, family records list missing names, and newspaper clippings from 1909 document frantic searches. Something happened. What that something was remains elusive, trapped between fact and rumor, reality and imagination. And so, more than 100 years later, the story continues to linger. Travelers still pass along the same stretch of track, glancing into the forest as though expecting to glimpse a rusted locomotive in the shadows. But there is nothing, only silence, trees, and the faint echo of a whistle that may have never stopped sounding. The morning of October 14, 1909, broke cold and pale over the quiet town of North Bay, Ontario. The sun rose reluctantly, shrouded in a gauzy veil of mist that clung to the treetops and curled along the edges of the wooden station platform. Locals would later recall the atmosphere as ordinary, almost too ordinary. Birds stirred in Thefrest, yet their calls sounded muffled, subdued, as if something in the air pressed down upon them. The town's clock tower struck 8, its bell reverberating across the sleepy streets. And then came the whistle, the long, low wail of the Canadian Northern Railway's westbound passenger train, signaling its readiness to depart. It was a familiar sound, comforting in its routine. But for those who had gathered that morning, it would become fellest memory, tethered to what is still one of Canada's strangest unsolved mysteries. The station was a modest affair, a weathered wooden building with peeling paint, its platform stretching toward the forest edge like a plank leading into the unknown. Porters hurried to and fro, carrying trunks, parcels, and carpetbags. The hiss of steam punctuated the chill as the black locomotive released short bursts of breath, impatient to move. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, Men smoked their morning pipes, and the scent of coal hung heavy in the damp air. It was a scene that might have played out countless times across the nation. Yet every detail from that day would later be dissected, reimagined, and mythologized. Among the passengers was the Whitfield family. Henry, a clerk traveling for business, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, Lucy, aged 7, and James, just 5 years old. Neighbors remembered how Lucy waved her doll in farewell while James clutched a small wooden horse. Their innocence would later serve as a haunting contrast to the fate that befell the train. Sitting a few rows ahead, a young theology student named Charles Grant carried with him a leather-bound Bible and a letter of recommendation to a seminary in Toronto. Further down the carriage, 2 miners laughed raucously, boasting of wages recently earned. A seamstress, a widower, and at least a dozen nameless others filled the compartments, all boarded with the expectation that within a few hours they would step off at the next station, perhaps to embrace loved ones, perhaps to pursue work, perhaps simply to continue the rhythms of life. At 8:20 a.m., the conductor's call rang out, clear and authoritative. All aboard. The final bags were loaded, the doors shut with a heavy clank, and the station fell into a brief hush. Then came the lurch, the familiar pull as iron wheels engaged the track, the steady chug of progress beginning. Witnesses described the train rolling forward with a sense of inevitability, vanishing into the fog-bound stretch of forest that bordered the town. To those left standing on the platform, it was an unremarkable moment, just another departure in a long line of departures. Yet none could have imagined that it would be the last time those passengers were seen alive. Between North Bay and the next scheduled stop at Cobalt lay scarcely 50 miles of track. The route was well-traveled, hugging lakeshores and cutting through pine forests that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was rugged country, but hardly uncharted. Freight trains passed through daily. Timber crews worked within earshot of the rails. The line had been inspected only weeks before and reported to be in sound condition. And yet, somewhere in that brief span of wilderness, the train dissolved into absence. When the locomotive failed to arrive at Cobalt by its scheduled time, no alarm was immediately raised. Trains were often delayed by minor issues: slippery rails, loading errors, or the occasional obstruction from fallen branches or livestock. The station master noted the tardiness, but assumed it would soon be corrected. An hour passed, then another. By noon, anxiety had set in. Telegrams were sent back along the line to North Bay, asking if the train had departed. The reply came swift and firm: yes, it had on time, with a full passenger load. Somewhere between the 2 towns, it had simply vanished. Search parties were dispatched that very afternoon. Railway inspectors rode trolleys along the line, scanning for signs of derailment. Woodsmen combed the underbrush for wreckage. Police officers interviewed those who had been near the tracks that morning. Yet nothing emerged. No splintered wood, no twisted metal, no scorched earth. The rails themselves were intact, gleaming in the pale light as if untouched. The only clues were whispers, rumors of a strange fog that had been seen hanging thick over a particular bend in the forest, of a black curtain that swallowed visibility whole. Some woodsmen claimed they had heard the whistle once, then abruptly cut short, as if muffled by some unseen hand. This is where fact begins to bleed into folklore. Newspaper articles from 1909 report the train's departure, its delay, and the subsequent search efforts. Archives confirm passenger lists, at least partially, through ticket stubs preserved by families who never saw their loved ones again. Yet the official investigation yielded no evidence. No ravine deep enough, no river swift enough, no swamp wide enough could account for the disappearance of an entire locomotive and multiple cars. Still, the folklore grew. Stories spread of a supernatural fog that appeared without warning, cloaking the train until it was no more. Others whispered of a curse upon that stretch of land. an old legend carried by indigenous communities, warning travelers of spirits that claimed those who trespassed too boldly. Of course, skeptics scoffed. They argued that the event was simply a case of poor record-keeping, exaggerated by grief and gossip. Perhaps the train had been rerouted or canceled, and subsequent confusion gave rise to myth. Perhaps a derailment had occurred in such a remote spot that the events remained hidden for decades. Yet even these explanations strain under scrutiny. How could a derailment of such magnitude leave no debris, no fire, no marks upon the land? How could a reroute escape documentation when telegraph lines connected stations with meticulous efficiency? The silence in the archive speaks as loudly as any ghost story. The families of the missing clung to what they knew. They had kissed loved ones goodbye. They had watched them board. They had never seen them return. For them, the disappearance wasn't an academic puzzle, but a wound that never closed. Margaret Whitfield's sister wrote in a letter preserved by descendants, "We waited at Cobalt until the sun fell. Children cried themselves to sleep in the station. Still no train came. It is as though they boarded a vessel bound not for Toronto, but for heaven itself. The departure off that train has since become one of Canada's most haunting legends, precisely because it sits on the razor's edge between history and myth. The details are grounded in reality, real stations, real tracks, real names, yet the absence of resolution invites endless speculation. Did human error erase it from the records, burying its wreckage beneath bureaucracy? Or did something unearthly intervene, swallowing steel, wood, and flesh into area beyond comprehension? What remains undeniable is the sense of foreboding that clings to the account of that final departure. Witnesses describe the whistle's last echo as strangely mournful, lingering longer than it should have. They recall the fog that thickened unnaturally as the train pulled away. They remember the silence that descended over the town once the cars disappeared around the bend. These may be tricks of memory, colored by the tragedy that followed. Or they may be fragments of a truth too strange to articulate. The last departure was not marked by chaos, flames, or screams. It was marked by routine, by order, by the banal details of everyday life proceeding as expected, until quite suddenly, nothing proceeded at all. And that is perhaps the most chilling element of the story, the ordinariness of the beginning, contrasted with the impossibility of the end. A train left a station, as trains had done countless times before. Yet this one never arrived. The stage was set, the chords marked, the memories sealed. The train had departed, carrying families, workers, and dreamers into the wilderness. What it carried them into, whether accident, conspiracy, or something far stranger, remains a question unanswered. And as the first section of this story closes, the whistle still echoes in imagination, suspended forever between departure and arrival, between fact and myth, between the world we know and the we fear might lie just beyond it. When the train failed to arrive at Cobalt on October 14, 1909, the first response from families waiting at the platform was patience. Delays were not uncommon on Canadian railways of the early 20th century, especially in autumn, when fallen branches and sudden weather shifts often disrupted timetables. Mothers held children by the hand, businessmen checked their pocket watches, and porters reassured the restless that the locomotive would appear any moment. But as the hours stretched into evening, unease began to thicken. Telegrams were sent, rumors passed in hushed voices, and anxious glances turned to the darkening tree line. By nightfall, patience had given way to fear. The passengers had not arrived, and the night brought no word of their fate. Families returned home without answers, hearts heavy with the dread that something irreversible had occurred. In the days that followed, the absence hardened into horror. Newspapers across Ontario printed columns describing the vanishing train of the Canadian North. Sketches of the missing were hastily published. A grainy portrait of the Whitfield family smiling stiffly before their modest home. A profile of theology student Charles Grant, a caricature of the miners who had boarded with laughter. Each article carried a tone of disbelief, struggling to frame the inexplicable within the language of journalism. Headlines alternated been cautious, train missing, search underway, and sensational, iron ghost swallowed by the woods. For the families, the sight of these headlines was both confirmation of loss and a cool reminder of how their private grief had become public spectacle. Margaret Whitfield's sister, who had waited at Cobalt with her children until the station grew silent, began searching the woods herself. For weeks, she joined volunteer groups carrying lanterns, combing through thickets, peering into ravines, calling names into the silence. Every snappet-wig beneath their boots sounded like hope, and every empty clearing crushed it again. Letters she later wrote, preserved by descendants, describe nights of despair. The forest is vast and my voice feels so small. Each tree holds its silence tighter than the last. I call their names until my throat bleeds, yet only the owls answer. She was not alone. Dozens of families organized searches, convinced that the authorities were withholding truth. Fathers trudged through mud until their boots split. Wives prayed on their knees at the edge of the tracks. Children peered out from wagons with wide, confused eyes. The wilderness, indifferent to grief, yielded no sign of the missing. The more the forest kept its silence, the more unbearable the waiting became. Without bodies to bury, without wreckage to touch, the families found themselves trapped in a limbo that no ritual could resolve. Clergy offered explanations steeped in faith. Priests from both Catholic and Protestant congregations preached that the disappearance was a trial from God, a test of patience and endurance for the faithful. Congregations swept together in pews, lifting voices in hymns that trembled with desperation. Some families found temporary comfort in these sermons, believing their loved ones had been called home by divine will. But for others, few words felt hollow, a convenient escape from the painful reality that no one knew what had actually happened. In stark contrast, skeptics turned their anger toward the railway company. They accused officials of negligence, of covering up a derailment or a collision, of protecting corporate interests at the cost of human lives. Letters of outrage appeared in newspapers. We entrusted our wives and children to your care. Where are they now? Don't tell us about fog and confusion. Give us the truth. Lawsuits were threatened, though without proof of what had happened, none succeeded. The company's vague statements about ongoing investigation only fueled suspicion. Bureaucracy became the enemy of grief, a cold wall against which families threw themselves in vain. The psychological toll deepened with each passing week. Widows awoke in the night to the phantom weight of absent husbands beside them. Children grew restless, some refusing to believe their parents were dead. Stories circulated of children insisting they could hear the whistle of the lost train in their dreams, calling faintly through the dark. One boy, the son of a missing ticket agent, was said to wander to the tracks at dusk, pressing his ear to the iron as if waiting to hear his father's footsteps. Whether these stories were true or products of rumor, they captured the aching human need to find meaning where none existed. Some families refused to surrender. A small group of women traveled to Ottawa, demanding that Parliament acknowledge the disappearance and fund further searches. Their petitions were largely ignored, dismissed as hysteria. Still, they persisted, knocking on doors of officials, showing faded photographs of loved ones, begging for action. Their determination was heroic, but also tragic, each rejection driving the knife of hopelessness deeper. Letters preserved from the time reveal a spectrum of emotional collapse. Some relatives clung fiercely to hope, writing as though their missing kin might read their words. Dearest Henry, the children and I wait for you at the table each evening. We know you will return, for the Lord does not take the righteous so soon. Others slipped into bitterness. The company has murdered them with silence. Their lives are lost not to the forest, but to lies, and some surrendered entirely. speaking of dreams in which their loved ones walked beyond a veil of fog, unreachable, already belonging to another world. For the wider community, the disappearance became both obsession and taboo. Taverns buzzed with theories late into the night: bandits, sabotage, a secret military train mistaken for civilian, even whispers of a government experiment gone wrong. At the same time, families of the missing often found themselves isolated, pitied but avoided, as if tragedy were contagious. Invitations dwindled, neighbors averted eyes, and grieving households sank into loneliness. Trauma reshaped the town itself, leaving scars not on the land but in human connection. Psychologists looking back on the case describe the family's plight as a textbook example of ambiguous loss, a grief without closure, where the absence of finality prevents healing. Unlike death, disappearance leaves the mind in constant oscillation, hope one moment, despair the next, belief in life followed a certainty of death, then back again. This psychological torture stretched for years. Even decades later, children of the missing spoke of how their lives were shaped by the silence left behind. Some never married, unwilling to build families of their own without understanding what had become of the one they lost. Others devoted themselves to archives and records, searching obsessively for any overlooked clue. Yet alongside despair grew mythology. Children whispered that the missing passengers had been taken by the woods, transformed into shadows that walked among the trees. Elderly women told stories of ghostly figures boarding trains at night, only to vanish before morning. Folklore filled the void left by unanswered questions, blurring the line between memory and legend. To believe their loved ones had crossed into another world was, for some, more bearable than imagining their bones lost forever in the earth. This is where a contrast between faith and reason, grief and bureaucracy, becomes sharpest. On one side stood families clinging to belief, ritual, or folkloretto, preserve the dignity of the missing. On the other side stood officials, papers, and silence-cold records. Fate refused to bend toward comfort. The two never reconciled. The railway company closed its file on the Disappearances after months of fruitless searching, but the families never closed theirs. In kitchens, in bedrooms, in whispered prayers, the question lingered: where are they? Over time, portraits of the missing hung in households like icons of saints. Their images faded, but the eyes seemed to follow, a reminder of unfinished stories. In some cases, descendants still keep those photographs, not as genealogy but as mystery, as proof of lives that once filled space and were suddenly erased. Every generation inherits the unanswered question, the unresolved grief, the haunting absence. This section of the story reminds us that mysteries are not measured on what vanishes, but by who is left to endure the vanishing. The missing train was more than a mechanical anomaly or a historical puzzle. It was a wound carved into human lives. Each lost passenger became the center of a private universe of grief, spinning endlessly around the black hole of absence. And while historians argue theories, while skeptics dismiss and believers romanticize, the truth for the families was simple and unbearable. Someone they loved boarded a train and never came back. That reality bridges us toward the larger questions that still echo. Was the train destroyed in some catastrophic accident, hidden from view? Was it hidden deliberately, swallowed by conspiracy as much as forest? Or was it stolen by forces that exist outside the realm of science? For the families, these questions were not academic. They were desperate pleas shouted into silence. And it is with their cries still resonating in the air that the story shifts, pulling us deeper into the possibility that the missing train was not merely lost, but concealed, whether by human hands or something far stranger. The disappearance of the Ontario passenger train in October 1909 demanded answers. Trains could be delayed, rerouted, even sabotaged, but they could not simply vanish into nothingness. At least, that was the assumption. Within hours of the missed arrival, railway officials mobilized their inspectors to walk the tracks. The line between the two stations was short, barely a handful of miles. If there had been a derailment, investigators checked to find twisted rails, scorched timbers, mangled cars scattered across the landscape. Instead, the tracks drawn in silence, cutting through dense forests and low hills with no sign of disruption. Every spick appeared intact, every tie in place, the steel rails shining in the weak October light. It was as if the train had been swallowed whole by an invisible hand, leaving the corridor of iron behind, untouched. Railway inspectors were thorough. They measured distances between ties, searched ditches, and followed the line with dogs, hoping animals might pick up the scent of oil or smoke. Nothing surfaced. No scent of fire, no leaking coal, no broken luggage cast aside in panic. Eyewitnesses at the departure station insisted they had seen the locomotive roll out in schedule, smoke trailing from its stack, wheels grinding forward with steady force. Witnesses at the destination insisted the train never arrived. Between those 2 points, nothing. It was the void itself that taunted them. The press descended quickly. Ontario newspapers ran bold headlines: "Passenger train vanishes between stations." "Families demand answers." Reporters interviewed railway clerks, station masters, even nearby farmers, hoping someone had seen a plume of smoke or heard the scream of metal in the night. Yet testimony was frustratingly consistent. The train had left, but it had not arrived. No one reported seeing an accident. No wreckage was found along the line. It was as if the rails had opened into another world and sealed shut behind them. Within a week, rumors of a cover-up began to circulate. The Grand Trunk Railway, one of Canada's most powerful companies, was no stranger to scandal. Accidents had plagued its history, and critics accused it of negligence and poor maintenance. Could this disappearance have been another disaster hastily swept under the rug? Skeptics argued that the company feared financial ruin if word of a deadly derailment spread. Better to bury the evidence, some whispered, than face lawsuits and public outrage. But skeptics faced one towering obstacle. How could a company, no matter how powerful, dispose of an entire train and dozens of passengers without leaving a trace? Some pointed to the geography itself. The line between the stations cut close to rivers and marshlands. Perhaps, they argued, the train had derailed at night, plunging into a body of water deep enough to conceal it. Sinkholes, though rare, were known to swallow entire barns or farmhouses. Could the earth have opened beneath the rails, devouring the locomotive before closing again? Such ideas tantalized the imagination, yet engineers dismissed them. No such sinkhole had been documented in the region, and the soil composition made it unlikely. Moreover, the tracks remained intact. A sinkhole capable of swallowing a locomotive would have bent or broken the steel rails, leaving obvious scars. None were found. The railway company's official stance was maddeningly vague. Representatives spoke of unresolved inconsistencies and possible miscommunication. In scheduling, they hinted that clerical errors may have compounded into a larger myth. Perhaps, they suggested, the train had been canceled or rerouted without proper notation. Families of the missing passengers reacted with outrage. They held up ticket stubs, waved receipts, and demanded to know where their loved ones had gone. Clerical error could not erase dozens of human beings. Police soon joined the effort, expanding searches beyond the line itself. Officers tramped through dense forests, questioning hermits and trappers, asking if anyone had seen the lights of a locomotive or heard the roar of its whistle. Farmers reported in silence. One claimed he had seen a strange fog settling along the tracks on the morning of the disappearance, a fog darker than smoke and clinging unnaturally low. Another swore he had heard the whistle sound twice, then abruptly cut off as though severed mid-breath. Such accounts, though dismissed as superstition, fed the growing narrative of something more sinister than mere clerical error. Theories of sabotage began to surface. Was it possible that someone had deliberately diverted the train onto an unused line, hiding it in the wilderness? Rail maps were scrutinized, but none revealed a spur capable of swallowing a passenger train without detection. Others whispered of bandits, though this too seemed implausible. Stealing a train was not like robbing a stagecoach. It required enormous resources, planning, and manpower. Even if hijacked, where could the perpetrators have hidden it? And why had no ransom ever been demanded? At one point, the Canadian military briefly involved itself, though records remain scarce. Some claim a regiment was dispatched to aid in search, believing the train may have been commandeered or destroyed by saboteurs. In 1909, Canada was still tethered closely to British interests, and fears of foreign interference simmered beneath the surface. Could an enemy force have tested Canadian infrastructure by targeting a passenger train? Military files released decades later make no mention of such fears, but the rumor persists. The most chilling evidence, however, still is in Canadian archives: ticket stubs from passengers who boarded the missing train, stamped and dated, but never marked as arrived. These scraps of paper anchor the legend. In fact, they are tangible proof that, at the very least, tickets were sold, passengers existed, and something happened. Archivists who have handled them describe a strange unease, as though the yellowed paper carries the weight of absence, a void that cannot be explained away by clerical error. And yet, conspiracy theories flourished precisely because the facts refused to settle. If the railway had truly covered up an accident, where were the bodies? Where was the wreckage? If that train had derailed, why had no smoke, fire, or debris been spotted? Families demanded inquests, but this yielded little more than frustration. Judges listened to testimony, examined timetables, and concluded only that the matter remained unresolved. Some suspected the courts themselves bowed to pressure from the railway, unwilling to expose negligence. As the years passed, the debate hardened into two camps: those who believed in natural explanations, and those who insisted on something more. The naturalists argued that record keeping in 1909 was far from reliable. Perhaps another train had been mistaken for the missing one, or perhaps the departure station had misreported the manifest. To them, the disappearance was less a supernatural event than a bureaucratic failure. The believers, however, clung to the fact that families had never been reunited, that ticket stubs still existed, and that no train was ever found. To them, the railway's silence reeked of guilt or worse, of knowledge it refused to share. In later decades, historians revisiting the case uncovered letters from railway employees who hinted at forbidden knowledge. One porter wrote of being told to keep quiet about the fog. Another described men in dark coats arriving at the station and confiscating logs. Were these exaggerations born of memory's distortions, or glimpses of a deliberate effort to erase the truth? Such fragments only deepen the enigma. The debate endures because the disappearance sits at the crossroads of science and myth. On one hand, trains are physical objects. They cannot evaporate. On the other, the void where this one should be remains simponatural. Hard science says the train must have derailed, sunk, or been hidden. Conspiracy theories say it was covered up, stolen, or perhaps slipped into a realm beyond comprehension. Both sides cling to their arguments, but neither can produce the one thing that would silence all others: the wreckage. Today, the stretch-off track remains in use, carrying freight and the occasional passenger service. Travelers look out their windows, imagining the missing locomotive somewhere in the trees. Railway enthusiasts visit the archives to view ticket stubs, running their fingers over the fading ink. And always, the question lingers: what happened in thus a few short miles of track in October 1909? Was it negligence, conspiracy, or something stranger still? The silence of the rails offers no reply. And so the mystery persists, a century-old puzzle that refuses to yield. In the absence of answers, it becomes a mirror reflecting our fears of loss, our distrust of authority, and our fascination with thin veil between fact and legend. Whether wreckage lies buried beneath soil, hidden in archives, or lost in some other dimension, no one can say. But the disappearance of the Ontario train remains one of Canada's most chilling unsolved enigmas, where hard steel, human lives, and history itself vanished without leaving a trace. The stretch of forest where the Ontario train vanished in 1909 is not merely landscape, it is legend. From Thimamet investigators admitted they had no wreckage, locals began whispering of a darker truth, one that had little to do with steel rails or human error. They spoke of spirits that had haunted those woods long before iron tracks cut across them. Spirits said to swallow the unwary, to claim lives when balance was disturbed. Thevenish train, to them, was not an accident, but a fulfillment. A machine had trespassed where it should not have, and the wilderness had taken its toll. Hunters and trappers were among the first to add fuel to the legend. These were men accustomed to silence, men who understood the normal rhythms of the forest, the call of birds, the rustle of branches, the distant splash of deer crossing a stream. Yet, in the months after the train's disappearance, many reported strange sounds that unsettled them. Some swore they heard a whistle echo infinitely through the trees, too far from any station, too deep within the woods to be real. Others described the ground trembling as though iron wheels still pressed across it, though no train ever came. More unnerving were reports of voices, low murmurs in languages the listeners did not recognize, carried on the wind like fragments of a forgotten chant. Indigenous legends of the region lent these accounts a chilling frame. Elders from local First Nations communities had long spoken of certain places where the boundaries between worlds ran thin. In these places, hunters were warned to tread lightly, for spirits guarded the passage between realms. Stories told of travelers who strayed too far and were never seen again, as if the forest had closed its jaws around them. Thevenish train seemed to echo these tales perfectly. Dozens of souls swallowed without trace, leaving only absence behind. To believers, the iron rails had pierced sacred ground, and the spirits had risen in answer. Skeptics, of course, argued differently. Psychologists pointed out that trauma often breeds superstition. The loss of so many lives without closure created a vacuum the human mind struggled to fill. When grief has no body to bury, no grave to mark, imagination steps in. A phantom whistle heard in the woods might simply be the echo of memory, sharpened by longing. Lantern lights seen flickering in the distance could just as easily be hunters, or foxfire igniting marsh gases. But to the villagers, explanations rooted in science rang hollow. They knew what they had heard, what they had seen. In their eyes, the forest had become haunted. Not metaphorically but literally. It was said that decades after the disappearance, lantern lights still appeared deep in the trees. Some claimed to see them swinging in steady rhythm, as though porters still guided passengers through the darkness. Others swore they saw entire outlines of train cars, glowing faintly in the mist, vanishing when approached. Camphorestories multiplied, each more terrifying than the last. One tale described a hunter who followed the fan whistle and never returned. Another spoke of children who dared each other to walk the tracks at night, only to flee screaming when a headlamp appeared in the distance before dissolving into fog. The psychology of folklore reveals how such stories thrive. A community shaken by inexplicable loss turns to myth as a survival mechanism. Myth explains what reason cannot, giving shape to the void. In this case, the myth was not a monster lurking in shadows, but a train itself, a machine rendered ghostly. The wilderness became its graveyard, and every strange sound became its voice. For villagers, telling the tale was a way to live with the inexplicable, to transform fear into narrative. Yet religion also offered its interpretation. Clergy spoke of divine punishment, a reminder that man's pride, the pride of conquering wilderness with iron, would always be checked. Churches filled with sermons warning that progress, unchecked, invited retribution. Some families clung to this explanation, seeing the loss not as random but as a divine trial. Others resisted, pointing instead to human greed and railway negligence. In this contrast, religion and reason clashed, but both left the same wound: no bodies, no closure. The line between science and superstition blurred further as the years passed. Travelers claimed fake animals avoided the stretch of track, circling wide as though sensing danger. Hunters whispered that the forest grew unnaturally still when one approached the site, as though even the wind feared to pass through. Whether coincidence, psychology, or something unearthly, the wilderness seemed to absorb the legend, wrapping itself in insolence. By mid-century, the story had evolved into full folklore. Campfires across Ontario flickered with rattlings of the ghost train. Children were warned never to linger by the tracks after dark, lest they hear the whistle and be pulled onto the phantom ride. Teenagers dared each other to leave coins on the rails, claiming that by morning the coins would vanish, carried away by the unseen locomotive. The story grew with every retelling, stretching beyond the boundaries of fact into the realm of cultural memory. The original disappearance became less a historical event than a haunting myth passed through generations. Still, those searching for logic persisted. Scientists who revisited the case argued that phantom whistles were nothing more than acoustic illusions. Sound, they explained, travels strangely in forests, bending along valleys and carrying farther at night. Lantern lights, they said, might have been swamp gases or hunters misinterpreted. And as for animals avoiding the site, perhaps the area was simply poor in prey, not cursed. Yet, the more rationalists explained, the more believers rested. After all, science had failed to provide the most important answer: where had the train gone? The legend eventually attracted a new kind of seeker: paranormal investigators. By the late 20th century, groups equipped with cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic detectors began visiting the site. They camped along the tracks, asking questions into the night, listening for phantom replies. Some claimed success. Recordings allegedly captured distant whistles where no train ran. Others caught bursts of static they swore resembled voices. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of the equipment, but to believers, each anomaly was proof. The forest was not silent, it was speaking, if only one learned to listen. Modern fascination with the case thrives on precisely this tension. To true crime enthusiasts, it remains a historical cold case, an unsolved disappearance being for forensic analysis. To mystery seekers, it is evidence of dimensions we barely understand. To locals, it is folklore, woven into the identity of the land itself. And to psychologists, it is a masterclass in how communities cope with unresolved grief, transforming tragedy into myth and myth into belief. The story of superstition in the wilderness is not simply about ghosts. It is about the human need to anchor the unexplainable. A vanished train becomes a ghost train. A silence in the forest becomes a whisper of spirits. A family's grief becomes a legend shared, so the pain is carried by many, not few. It is this transformation from fact to folklore that ensures the 1909 disappearance endures. For even if the rails remain quiet, the story continues to move, like a phantom locomotive pressing endlessly through the night. And so, more than a century later, the forest where the train was lost is less a place on a map than a place in the mind. Visitors walk the tracks not just to see steel and timber, but to feel the weight of the legend. They pause, listen, and wonder, is that the wind or the echo of a whistle no one alive has ever truly heard? When reason fails, theories rush in to fill the void. More than a century has passed since the October morning hen, the Ontario passenger train, rolled out of the station and into legend, yet the world has never agreed on what became of it. The absence of wreckage, the silence of official reports, the grief of families all have combined to create fertile ground for speculation. In hushed tones, the story is told and retold, each narrator offering an explanation that feels compelling in its own right. only to dissolve when held against the facts. Some theories lean on history and logic, others on shadow and superstition, and still others on darker possibility hidden beneath the surface of power. Together they form a mosaic of contradictions, each piece tempting, not a complete. Historians begin with the most straightforward explanation. The train, they argue, may never have existed as described. Early 20th century rail travel was extensive, schedules were tangled, and record-keeping was often sloppy. It was not unusual for routes to change, for delays to be poorly communicated, or for tickets to be reassigned at the last moment. Could it be, some suggest, that the legend of the vanishing train is little more than the product of clerical confusion? A scheduled train delayed, another canceled. Families left waiting for an arrival that had in fact been rerouted. Over time, stories merged, memories blurred, and what was once human error hardened into myth. Newspaper clippings, stripped of context, may have exaggerated the confusion, and generations later the narrative calcified into a tale of disappearance. Yet this theory falters at its core. Too many passenger logs survive, too many names attached to that journey, too many families reporting loved ones who never returned. Ticket stubs in the Canadian archives, their ink faded but legible, are stubborn artifacts of presence. If the train never existed, why do these documents remain? Why did railway officials issue initial statements acknowledging the departure, even as they later attempted to obscure the facts? History may shrug, but the paper trail refuses to vanish as easily as the train itself. Conspiracy theorists turn this very contradiction into fuel for a darker narrative. To them, the absence of wreckage is not proof of error, but of deliberate concealment. They claim the train was carrying more than passengers, that it held cargo too dangerous, too secret, to risk exposure. Some whisper of military shipments, early experiments with chemical agents or classified machinery hidden among the luggage. Others point to the global climate of 1909, a world on the edge of change, where nations eyed each other with suspicion and new technologies promised both power and peril. Could it be, they ask, that the train was deliberately erased from public record because its disappearance was orchestrated from the start? A derailment covered up to avoid scandal, or worse, an intentional diversion into obscurity to bury what should never have been moved across civilian tracks. The idea is intoxicating because it aligns with human suspicion of authority. We know governments conceal, corporations misload, and institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals. In this light, the missing train becomes less a supernatural puzzle and more a crime of silence, a scandal wiped clean from the surface of history. Yet the theory raises its own questions. If a cover-up occurred, why were families left to grieve publicly? Why not offer compensation or a fabricated wreckage to quiet suspicion? Why let whispers of ghosts spread when a plausibly would have sufficed? Unless, as some argue, the disappearance itself was so catastrophic, so uncontrollable, that silence was the only refuge left. And then come the paranormal believers, their voices steady with conviction. To them, the train did not derail, did not explode, was not hidden in secret depots. It passed instead into another realm. They point to other cases scattered across time and geography, ships that vanished into fog, planes that disappeared from radar, caravans swallowed by desert sands with no trace. Patterns emerge, they say, of entire groups slipping between worlds, perhaps through rifts in reality too rare to map, but too powerful to dismiss. The phantom whistles heard in the forest, the lantern lights glimpsed in the trees, become evidence of a train forever caught between places, half in our world, half in another. This idea terrifies because it suggests permanence. If the train was stolen by men, it might someday be found. If it derailed, wreckage could eventually emerge. But if it crossed a threshold beyond our understanding, then its passengers are lost forever, trapped in a twilight place where time and space unravel. Paranormal theorists argue that this is why no scrap of metal was ever recovered, no body identified. The train was not destroyed, it was displaced. Its iron and flesh, laughter and screams, steam and soot, all dissolved into the unseen. Psychologists push back, pointing out that the human mind gravitates toward the extraordinary when ordinary grief is unbearable. Belief in rifts, spirits, or curses offers a strange comfort. If the loved ones are not dead, but simply elsewhere, then hope remains. Rational explanations, clerical error, corporate negligence feel thin, even cruel. Supernatural explanations hover frightening, give shape to despair. They transform meaningless loss into cosmic narrative. And yet, the persistence of paranormal belief cannot be dismissed as merely wishful thinking, for the stories endure across cultures and eras. Why does the same pattern emerge again and again? Why do ships, planes, and trains share this eerie fate of vanishing? Coincidence or continuity? Between these poles of explanation, other theories emerge like shadows. Some claim the train was stolen, not erased by government or cosmos, but hijacked beaming with purpose. A diversion onto a hidden track, a sale of passengers into dark markets, a crime so massive it required erasure of evidence. This theory reeks of pulp fiction, yet it clings to possibility. Others suggest natural disaster, a sinkhole opening suddenly beneath the rails, swallowing the train whole. Canada's wilderness is vast, riddled with rivers, marshes, and shifting earth. Could a geological catastrophe account for the loss? If so, why has no evidence surfaced in more than 100 years? The more one examines the possibilities, the less certain the truth becomes. Rational explanations sound unsatisfying, like paperwork stretched thin over a wound. Supernatural explanations sound terrifyingly possible, like whispers that will not be silenced. Conspiracy theories feed on distrust, while folklore feeds on fear, and together they weave a net that traps every listener. One cannot escape the question: if a train can vanish, what else might the world conceal? The debate rages still, both in academic halls and in online forums, where strangers argue deep into the night. Some bring maps, plotting the exact coordinates of the last sighting. Others bring scripture, declaring divine judgment. Still others bring grainy photographs, claiming to show spectral trains in the mist. And all of them, no matter their conviction, remain bound by the same emptiness, the absence of proof. Theories refuse to die precisely because no theory can be slain by evidence. Nothing definitive exists, and so imagination rules. Perhaps that is the cruel genius of the missing train. Its silence outlives every attempt to explain it. Clerks and priests, scientists and shamans, all step forward with answers, only to be undone by the void. The tracks remain, the archives remain, the grief remains, but the train itself is gone. In that emptiness, we project our deepest fears: human error, human greed, human evil, or forces beyond humanity altogether. And so the audience is left with the same haunting choice that has lingered since 1909. Was the train destroyed in secret, its truth buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies? Or did it cross into a place beyond our understanding, a realm where steel and flesh dissolve into silence? What do y'all think? The story closes where it began, in silence. More than a century has passed since that October morning in 1909, and still the Canadian wilderness keeps its secret. No locomotive has been uncovered beneath the rivers. No rusted carriage has emerged from the soil. The forest seems to mock human certainty, swallowing up all evidence as though steel and wood were no stronger than autumn leaves. Historians point to holes in the records, clerks who misfiled paperwork, or rail companies desperate to bury scandal. Yet, each time the subject is raised, the absence of wreckage gnaws at reason like an unanswered knock at midnight. It is one thing for a man to vanish, another for an entire train filled with passengers to dissolve into history without a trace. And so the story becomes less about answers and more about echoes. Families who once waited at the platform have long since passed, but their grief hangs like an unfinished chord. The case lives on in yellowed newspapers, in dusty archives, in whispers carried from grandfather to grandson. To stand by those tracks today is to feel time collapsing. The same rails where laughter and luggage once rattled now lie rusting under moss, and the silence feels staged, as though the woods themselves are keeping watch. Some believe the truth sleeps in an overlooked arch box, mislabeled and forgotten. Others cling to the possibility of a hidden ravine, a place where the train lies entombed beneath centuries of rock slides and roots. But folklore does not settle for paperwork or geology. Campfire tales insist that the train still runs, not on iron rails but through a world beside our own. Travelers claim to hear a phantom whistle cutting across the midnight air, a sound that vanishes as soon as it is named. A few even whisper that, on certain mist-heavy nights, a glow drifts through the trees like lanterns strung along invisible carriages. Are these tricks of imagination, or the restless echo of a journey that never concluded? Perhaps that is why this story endures, not because it promises resolution, but because it denies it. The missing train stands as a reminder that history is not airtight, that progress can be swallowed whole, and that the line between fact and folklore is thinner than we admit. The train left the station. Witnesses swore they saw it depart. Tickets were sold, families waited, timetables printed its schedule. Yet more than a century later, its arrival has never been recorded. And so the final question lingers like a shadow on the tracks. Did the passengers perish in secret, their bodies hidden by human hands? Or are they still moving, sealed in some other corridor of reality, unaware that their journey has become legend? The train left, but it never arrived. And perhaps, somewhere out there, its journey still hasn't ended.